briefly cover a couple examples. Please check out my 3 videos about the angel of the Lord for more examples. 1 Samuel 13:3 and 4 says that Jonathan struck down the garrison of the Philistines, but then verse 4 says that Saul did. So who actually struck down the garrison of the Philistines, Saul or Jonathan? Obviously Jonathan, even though he is actually called Saul in the very next verse. To quote Greg Deuble from Appendix 3, Divine Agency, in his book, in Hebrew thought, a king's personality extended through his entire household, so that the messenger representative was conceived as being personally, and in his very words and actions, the presence of the sender. Another example is in 2 Chronicles 4. In verse 11, Hiram made the cans and shovels and bowls and finished the work that he did for King Solomon in the house of the true God. Yet verses 18 through 20, it says that Saul actually made these utensils in great quantity. So who really made the temple utensils? Solomon or Hiram? Obviously Hiram, who is actually identified as Solomon, because to quote R.A. Johnson, in Hebrew thought, a patriarch's personality extended through his entire household, to his wives, his sons and their wives, his daughters, servants in his household, and even, in some sense, his property. In a specialized sense, when the patriarch, as lord of his household, deputized his trusted servant as his malach, his messenger or angel, the man was endowed with the authority and resources of his lord to represent him fully and transact business in his name. In Semitic thought, this messenger representative was conceived as being personally, and in his very words, the presence of the sender. Let me emphasize again, I don't know how these men apply this principle theologically, and again, that isn't my concern. I personally find these principles in Scripture, simple as that. Let me give one final scriptural example. I'm trying to avoid the ones I've already covered in other videos. Matthew chapter 20, the mother of the sons of Zebedee approached Jesus with her sons, doing obeisance and asking for something from him. He said to her, "What do you want?" And she said to him, "Give the word that these two my sons may sit down, one at your right hand and one at your left in your kingdom." But in Mark chapter 10, it's James and John who actually ask these things of Christ. So who actually asked these things of Christ? Obviously the mother of James and John, who was commissioned by them to inquire of their Lord these things. Yet Scripture actually identifies her in the book of Mark as her 2 sons, because in Hebrew thought, the agent is treated as if, even identified as if they are the sender. It is only anyone's inference that this angel was the pre-existent Christ. I don't care how the angel of the Lord, I don't care how strong you think the evidence is, it is still an inference. Do not base your doctrine on inference when we have the sufficiency of Scripture to define God in Christ succinctly. I'm not saying you should never speculate or search the deeper things of God, but to be dogmatic about something that Scripture isn't explicit about, to recognize a biblical principle and fail to let it apply where we don't want it to, is all foolishness. To quote the NIV Study Bible, which acknowledges the principle of divine agents being identified with God himself, it says traditional Christian interpretation has held that this angel was a pre-incarnate manifestation of Christ as God's messenger servant. It may be, however, that, as the Lord's personal messenger who represented him and bore his credentials, the agent could speak on behalf of and so be identified with the one who sent him. Whether this angel was the second person of the Trinity remains therefore uncertain. There are some text debates on these agency videos that Brian and Bill uploaded in response to mine. YouTube user Scriptural Truths from scripturaltruths.com, Dave, was able to articulate quite well why ancient Hebrew thought is important to the modern-day Bible reader. He said in a comment, the Jews had no problem calling an exalted figure by God's name without equating the two ontologically. For example, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, Psalm 7:7-8 is applied to the heavenly Melchizedek, wherein Yahweh appears in the Hebrew text, yet without equating the two. If the Jewish author of that text could write as much, why could Paul not do the same without equating them ontologically? Brian and Bill accused Dave of looking at extra-biblical mystical literature to get his ideas, to which Dave repeatedly defended himself. He said, "I never suggest that these works are on par with Scripture. Instead, we learn from the DSS and other texts how the first-century Jews thought and wrote. The burden of proof is on you to show that the New Testament's authors did not write as their contemporaries, which is my only argument. The New Testament authors quoted Old Testament texts about God and applied them to Jesus. Jewish writers of the time did the same and applied them to exalted figures." In another comment, Dave said, "I maintain that if we are to understand the Bible, we must understand how the people who wrote the Bible and read it at that time thought. You choose to read the Bible as a modern. I choose to learn how people in the first century would have read it." Because apparently Brian and Bill didn't like that Dave had done his research and understands the importance of examining how the Hebrews thought in ancient times in regards to agents being as the principals, called their names and titles, they continually accuse and berate instead of offering anything of real value. It's called ad hominem. If you want to see the full text debates, they're on all the videos about the agency principle that Bill and Brian uploaded in response to mine. Bill looked at a website and jumped to a million conclusions. Another of Dave's comments was, "There appears to be a huge body of scholarship of which you are completely unaware. Authors such as Hurtado, McGrath, etc. fully recognize agency and its Christological import, with varied conclusions on the precise implications. You would do well to consider some of the authors who discuss this in detail, though going into the source text is certainly ideal. You believe scholarship is against me, when just the truth of the matter is just the opposite." Dave also said the bottom line is actually that I can and have given clear examples of how the New Testament writers parallel Jewish writers of their time, leaving little ambiguity as to what they thought. Because Brian and Bill just weren't understanding Dave's logic, he said, "You continue to miss the point, but I'm getting to the point where I wonder if you're doing it intentionally for fear of the implications. The fact is there are unambiguous parallels between the methodologies of the New Testament's authors and those of other Jewish literature in the language employed of Jesus and exalted agents, respectively. It is not about the interpretation itself, but the methods employed and the way things were written. In this there is great significance." An argument of Brian's. The Jewish law of agency requires a witness for both parties. When only Jesus and the Father existed before creation, who witnessed the agreement? The fact is that you are reading this back into the Scriptures, Dave. Dave answered, "No, I'm not arguing doctrine with agency. I'm demonstrating a culture and their use of language and concepts. This is a diverse range of Jewish sources, not just one. Hence we can look to it. That the New Testament uses language and concepts in the same way demonstrates this. Don't confuse agency among men with the divine. The Bible expressly articulates Jesus' agency in creation, so I accept it. These men, Bill and Brian, admit that in Scripture, agents and representatives can bear the names of the principal or their senders. Yet when it comes to Christ, conveniently enough, they inexplicably pretend that's an impossibility, with nothing but what seems to communicate to me personally. I'm a Trinitarian, and if I admit it's possible, my theory about the angel of the Lord being the second person of his sender's substance loses merit. Why, yes, it would. If for some reason I do have what the Hebrew and scriptural reality is actually termed wrong, then again I'm going to need better proof than a quote from a website and an assumption that even if that website is correct, it can't have a broader application. As evident in ancient Jewish literature contemporary to the Bible and what seems to be explicitly just like the Jewish law throughout the Bible itself, making it applicable anywhere I find it in Scripture logically, and not just where it doesn't threaten a 4th century creed that defies scriptural creed. Bill and Brian's isolation of a text that says Christ created without using all the creation texts together that expound upon how Christ created as the agent through whom God did is both dishonest and sketchy. 1 Corinthians 8:5 and 6 and Hebrews 1:3, to name just a couple, let us know clearly who the source is, Jehovah, and who the channel agent is, his Son. To ignore those when we isolate a text where it says Christ created is to blatantly disregard biblical emphasis elsewhere on how this was accomplished. Christ created the same way Moses led the Israelites through the Red Sea, as the agent through whom God did. So if this is Brian and Bill's proof that Christ is the same God his own Father and God is, they're on seriously shaky ground by any reasonable standards. I am much less interested in thorough research about what this biblical agency principle is actually called than just observing it in Scripture and accepting what I find while not being quick to dismiss its application where it would shake faith in my tradition. I also, like Dave, recognize the worth in heeding contemporary to the Bible Jewish literature for genuine evidence of Hebraic thought in relation to the theological application of this Jewish law.